The sun was shining brightly on a quiet Saturday afternoon in a suburban neighborhood where perfectly trimmed lawns and colorful flower beds lined the streets. Birds chirped lazily in the background, and the faint smell of freshly cut grass filled the air. It was the kind of day that made people want to relax outside, enjoy the weather, and maybe fire up the grill for a late lunch. Emma, a cheerful 25-year-old with a knack for storytelling, had driven over to her parents' house earlier that morning. Her dad, Jim, was already in his element, wearing his favorite apron that read Grill Master in bold letters. He hummed an old tune as he prepared the charcoal grill in their spacious backyard. The grill was more than just a cooking tool. It was a symbol of family traditions. Every weekend, no matter how busy life got, Jim would cook something special outdoors, bringing everyone together around the table. Today's menu: juicy burgers topped with caramelized onions, melted cheese, and all the fixings. Emma helped by slicing tomatoes and setting up the picnic table under the shade of a large oak tree. She loved these moments with her dad. There was something comforting about watching him work the grill, flipping patties with precision and sharing funny stories from his days as a firefighter before he became the town's fire marshal. As the coals turned white-hot and the aroma of sizzling meat began to waft through the air, everything seemed perfect. Neighbors strolled by with their dogs or waved hello from across the street. It felt like the ideal suburban scene, the kind you'd see in a movie. But little did they know, trouble was brewing just a few feet away. Their peaceful afternoon took an unexpected turn when a shrill voice interrupted the calm. "What do you think you're doing?" came the sharp demand. Both Emma and Jim turned to see Karen, their neighbor from 2 doors down, standing near the fence that separated their yards. Dressed in workout leggings and holding a clipboard, she looked every bit the part of someone who took the HOA rules very seriously. Her lips were pursed into a tight line, and her arms were crossed firmly over her chest. Jim raised an eyebrow, but kept his tone friendly. "Just grilling some burgers," he said with a smile. "Care to join us?" Karen didn't return the smile. Instead, she tapped her clipboard dramatically. "You can't grill here," she declared. "It's against the HOA guidelines. Outdoor cooking poses a fire hazard." Emma exchanged a glance with her dad, trying not to laugh at the absurdity of the situation. Fire hazard? Seriously. This was coming from a woman whose idea of outdoor decor included string lights plugged into an extension cord running across her wet lawn after rainstorms. Still, Jim remained calm and professional, explaining that he followed all safety protocols and even had the necessary permits for grilling. But Karen wasn't having any of it. She stood her ground, glaring at them as if daring them to continue. And so, what started as a relaxing family afternoon suddenly turned into something far more interesting and ridiculous than anyone could have imagined. What happened next would become the stuff of neighborhood legend. Karen's arrival was like a sudden storm cloud rolling in on an otherwise sunny day. She stood at the edge of Jim's yard, her posture rigid and her expression one of sheer determination. Her clipboard seemed to be her weapon of choice, clutched tightly against her chest as if it held all the answers to life's problems. Her piercing glare locked onto Jim, who was still calmly tending to the grill, oblivious to the drama she was about to unleash. "You're breaking the rules," Karen repeated, her voice sharp enough to cut through the gentle hum of the neighborhood. "Outdoor grilling is prohibited. It's a safety hazard. What if a spark flies and sets something on fire? Have you thought about that?" Jim paused mid-flip, his spatula hovering over the sizzling burgers. He glanced at Emma, who was struggling to stifle a laugh, then turned back to Karen with a patient smile. "I appreciate your concern," he said smoothly, "but I'm well aware of fire safety regulations. In fact, I've been enforcing them for years." Karen blinked, momentarily caught off guard by his calm demeanor. But she quickly recovered, straightening her shoulders and raising her chin. "That doesn't matter," she snapped. "Rules are rules. And the HOA clearly states no outdoor cooking unless it's done in designated areas. Your grill isn't in a designated area." Emma couldn't help herself anymore. Designated area. She blurted out, gesturing toward the neatly arranged patio where the grill sat. This asterisk is asterisk our backyard. Isn't that kind of obvious? Karen shot her a look that could freeze water. It's not up to you to interpret the rules, she said curtly. If you don't comply, I'll have no choice but to report this. At this point, a small crowd had begun to gather. Neighbors peeked over fences or lingered casually in their driveways, pretending not to eavesdrop while secretly soaking in every word. Some looked amused, others confused, but everyone was curious to see how this confrontation would play out. After all, Karen wasn't exactly known for her subtlety. She'd earned a reputation for being overly zealous when it came to enforcing HOA guidelines, whether it was policing mailbox colors, scrutinizing holiday decorations, or lecturing people about lawn maintenance. Jim, ever the diplomat, decided to try reasoning with her again. "Look, Karen," he said gently, "I assure you there's no danger here. I've taken every precaution. The grill is away from anything flammable, and I'm keeping a close eye on it. If you'd like, I can show you my permit and explain the safety measures I follow." But Karen wasn't interested in listening. She shook her head firmly, her blonde ponytail swishing with indignation. "Permits don't override the HOA rules," she insisted. "And frankly, I don't trust just anyone to handle something as risky as open flames. People make mistakes." Emma bit her lip to keep from retorting. Mistakes. This was coming from the same woman who once left a candle burning overnight in her living room and nearly caused a real fire scare. Still, Jim remained unfazed. He wiped his hands on his apron and gave Karen a polite nod. "All right, Karen. I understand your concerns, but I can assure you everything is under control." Unfortunately, Karen wasn't satisfied. Her lips pressed into a thin line, and her grip on the clipboard tightened. "Fine," she huffed. "If you won't stop voluntarily, I'll take further action." With that ominous declaration, she spun on her heel and marched back toward her house, muttering under her breath about irresponsible neighbors and the importance of following rules. As soon as Karen disappeared from view, Emma burst out laughing. "Dad, did that seriously just happen?" she asked, clutching her sides. "She thinks she's some kind of rule enforcer superhero." Jim chuckled, shaking his head. "Well, we'll see how far she gets with this one," he said, turning back to the grill. "Now let's finish these burgers before they burn." But even as they resumed their afternoon barbecue, neither of them realized that Karen wasn't bluffing. She meant business, and within minutes, their quiet neighborhood would become the stage for a showdown unlike anything they'd experienced before. Karen's words echoed in the air as she stormed off, her clipboard swinging like a sword after a battle. But it didn't take long for everyone to realize she wasn't just making empty threats. Within minutes, the peaceful hum of the neighborhood was shattered by the unmistakable wail of sirens. A fire truck, its lights flashing brightly, rolled into the cul-de-sac, creating a scene that felt more like a movie than real life. Emma froze mid-bite of a freshly grilled burger, her eyes wide with disbelief. "Wait, is that for us?" she asked, pointing toward the commotion. Jim, who had been seasoning another batch of patties, turned around and raised an eyebrow. Sure enough, the massive red fire truck came to a stop right outside their driveway. Neighbors who had been casually watching from afar suddenly sprang into action, rushing closer to see what all the fuss was about. Some grabbed their phones to record the spectacle, while others whispered among themselves, speculating wildly about what could possibly be happening. The firefighters hopped out of the truck, looking both professional and slightly confused. They approached Jim's yard, their boots crunching against the gravel path. One of them, a tall man with a friendly face, stepped forward. "We got a call about reckless grilling activity," he said, glancing at the grill. "Mind telling us what's going on here?" Jim blinked, momentarily stunned. Then, a slow grin spread across his face. He set down his spatula and wiped his hands on his apron before extending one to the firefighter. "Hi there," he said warmly. I'm Jim. And yes, I'd be happy to explain. At first, the firefighters seemed puzzled by Jim's relaxed demeanor. Most people would have been flustered or defensive in such a situation, but not him. As Jim began explaining the circumstances, the captain squinted at him, recognition slowly dawning. "Wait a second," the captain said, snapping his fingers. Jim Thompson, the fire marshal." "That's me," Jim confirmed with a chuckle. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his badge, holding it up for everyone to see. There was a collective murmur from the crowd of neighbors, and even the firefighters exchanged amused glances. It was clear they knew exactly who Jim was. In fact, many of them had attended training sessions or community workshops led by him over the years. Meanwhile, Karen reappeared, hovering nervously near the edge of the gathering. Her arms were still crossed, though now her expression carried a hint of uncertainty. She must have realized things weren't going quite as she planned. When the firefighters noticed her standing there, one of them tilted his head curiously. "Ma'am, were you the one who called this in?" he asked politely. Karen hesitated, clearly torn between doubling down and backing off. Finally, she cleared her throat and said, "Well, yes, I did call. Someone needed to do something. This kind of behavior sets a bad example for the neighborhood." The firefighters exchanged knowing looks, trying hard not to laugh. One of them leaned over to Jim and whispered loud enough for Emma to hear, "You've got some interesting neighbors, huh?" Jim chuckled good-naturedly. "You have no idea." With the situation under control and no actual danger present, the firefighters wrapped up their visit quickly. They reassured everyone that everything was safe, praised Jim for following proper safety protocols, and climbed back into their truck. As they drove away, the sirens silent this time, the crowd of neighbors slowly dispersed, many shaking their heads in amusement. But the drama wasn't over yet. Karen lingered awkwardly, her face flushed with embarrassment. For once, she didn't have anything to say. Instead, she muttered something about needing to check on her garden and hurried back to her house, avoiding eye contact with anyone. Emma couldn't resist teasing her dad as they returned to the picnic table. "So, Dad," she said with a grin, "what's next? Are we calling CNN to report the Great Grillgate scandal?" Jim laughed, flipping another burger onto a plate. "Let's just finish lunch," he said. "Though I have a feeling this isn't the last we've heard of Karen." Little did they know, karma was already lining up its next move, and Karen's day was far from over. The moment the firefighters left, the neighborhood seemed to exhale a collective breath of disbelief mixed with amusement. Emma couldn't stop giggling as she watched her dad return to flipping burgers like nothing out of the ordinary had just happened. "Dad," she said between laughs, "you literally just schooled an entire fire crew about fire safety while grilling burgers. That's peak life right there." Jim shrugged modestly, though there was a twinkle in his eye. "Well, when you spend decades teaching people how to stay safe, it kind of sticks with you," he said with a chuckle. "Besides, it's not every day I get to pull out my badge at a backyard barbecue." But Karen wasn't ready to let things go so easily. At least not without one last attempt to save face. She lingered near her fence, pretending to prune some non-existent weeds, but her eyes kept darting toward Jim and Emma. Her cheeks were flushed red, whether from embarrassment or frustration. It was hard to tell. Finally, she called out again, her voice laced with forced confidence. "I still think this sets a bad precedent," Karen declared loudly enough for the remaining neighbors to hear. "Just because you happen to know what you're doing doesn't mean everyone else does." Emma rolled her eyes so hard she thought they might get stuck. "Oh, come on," she muttered under her breath. But Jim simply smiled and walked over to the fence, leaning casually against it. His tone was calm, almost playful, as he addressed Karen directly. "You're absolutely right," he said, nodding thoughtfully. "Not everyone knows the rules as well as I do, or as well as you apparently do, Karen, which is why I'm always happy to help educate people about fire safety." He paused for effect, letting his words sink in before adding, In fact, if you'd like, I could host a little workshop for the neighborhood sometime. We could go over proper grilling techniques, fire prevention tips, the whole 9 yards. Karen blinked, caught completely off guard by the offer. For a brief second, it looked like she might actually consider it. But then her pride kicked in, and she stiffened, crossing her arms tightly across her chest. "No, thank you," she said curtly. "I already know everything I need to know." Emma snorted, earning a sharp glare from Karen. "Sure you do," Emma mumbled, loud enough for her dad to hear, but soft enough to avoid another confrontation. Jim shot her a warning glance, not because he disagreed, but because he knew better than to escalate things further. As the afternoon wore on, the story of what had happened spread like wildfire through the neighborhood. Neighbors who hadn't been outside during the commotion quickly heard about the fire truck showing up for a harmless grill session, and the fact that Jim was none other than the local fire marshal. Some came over to congratulate him, clapping him on the back and joking about how Karen had picked the wrong guy to mess with. Others brought snacks and drinks, turning the impromptu gathering into a full-blown party. Even the kids got in on the fun, running around the yard and pretending to be firefighters. One little boy grabbed a stick and mimicked holding a hose, shouting, "Stand back. The grill master is under control." Everyone erupted into laughter, including Jim, who tipped an imaginary hat to the boy. Meanwhile, Karen stayed mostly out of sight, peeking through her curtains every now and then to gauge the situation. It was clear she regretted calling 911, though she would never admit it. Instead, she busied herself indoors, muttering about irresponsible behavior and setting boundaries. By the time the sun began to set, the atmosphere in the neighborhood felt lighter, almost celebratory. What had started as a tense standoff had turned into a bonding experience for everyone except Karen. And while no one held any real animosity toward her, it was impossible not to find humor in the absurdity of the situation. As Emma helped her dad clean up the grill, she glanced over at Karen's house and smirked. "You know," she said, "if she ever decides to throw her own barbecue, we should totally crash it, just to see what happens." Jim laughed, shaking his head. "Let's give her a break, for now, anyway. But hey, if she does decide to grill someday, maybe we'll lend her our spatula. Lord knows she could use the help." Little did they know, Karen's next big move would prove to be even more entertaining and far more ironic than anyone could have predicted. By Monday morning, the story of Karen's ill-fated attempt to shut down Jim's barbecue had become the talk of the neighborhood. It wasn't just whispered gossip anymore. It was full-blown legend. Neighbors who hadn't even witnessed the scene firsthand were sharing embellished versions of the tale, adding dramatic flair with each retelling. Some claimed Karen had stormed into the fire station herself to demand action, while others joked that Jim had single-handedly taught the firefighters a thing or two about grilling burgers during their visit. Emma couldn't resist fueling the fire, pun intended, by posting a lighthearted recap on social media. She didn't name names, but it was obvious who the overzealous HOA enforcer was in her story. Within hours, the post went viral, racking up likes, comments, and shares from people across town. Even some of Jim's colleagues weighed in, teasing him about becoming an internet sensation. But as the days passed, something unexpected happened. Karen started to fade into the background. Gone was the clipboard-wielding crusader who once patrolled the streets, inspecting mailboxes for height violations or lecturing homeowners about lawn ornaments. Instead, she kept to herself, avoiding eye contact with neighbors and sticking close to her house. Whether it was guilt, embarrassment, or sheer stubbornness, no one could say for sure. But her sudden retreat only added fuel to the growing sense of irony surrounding the whole situation. Then came Friday evening, when word spread that Karen was hosting a small garden party at her home. Invitations had been sent out earlier in the week, though Emma suspected they were more about saving face than genuine hospitality. Still, curiosity got the better of many neighbors, including Emma and Jim, who decided to attend, partly out of politeness and partly to see what Karen would do next. When they arrived, the setup was interesting, to say the least. Karen had clearly gone out of her way to avoid any potential rule breaking. There was no grill in sight, not even a portable one. Instead, she'd set up an electric hot plate indoors and was using it to warm appetizers like mini quiches and stuffed mushrooms. Strings of battery-operated fairy lights adorned her patio, and a strict "no open flames" sign hung prominently near the entrance. "Wow," Emma whispered to her dad as they grabbed paper plates. "She's really doubling down on this whole safety thing, huh?" Jim chuckled, surveying the scene. "Looks like she's trying to prove a point. Too bad she missed the memo that indoor cooking can be just as risky if you're not careful." As if on cue, disaster struck. A loud popping sound came from inside the house, followed by shouts of alarm. Smoke began billowing through the open windows, and within moments, Karen emerged looking panicked, waving a towel frantically at the smoke detector that was now blaring incessantly. Her guests exchanged awkward glances, unsure whether to laugh or help. Without hesitation, Jim sprang into action. He grabbed a nearby fire extinguisher, a gift he'd given Karen last Christmas, and quickly located the source of the problem: a faulty outlet that had sparked when overloaded by too many appliances. With calm precision, he put out the small electrical fire before it could spread further. When the smoke cleared, everyone let out a collective sigh of relief. Karen stood frozen, her face pale and her hands trembling. For once, she didn't have a snarky comment or a clipboard to hide behind. All she could manage was a weak "thank you," directed at Jim. The irony of the situation wasn't lost on anyone. Here was Karen, the self-appointed guardian of neighborhood safety, causing a minor fire hazard in her own kitchen. And here was Jim, the actual fire marshal, swooping in to save the day again. As the guests filtered back outside, sipping lemonade and laughing nervously, Emma leaned over to her dad and grinned. "Well," she said, "I guess we know who the real hero of the HOA is now." Jim smiled, shaking his head. "Let's just hope this teaches her a lesson about minding her own business, and maybe trusting experts every once in a while." And with that, the night ended on a surprisingly sweet note. Karen may have tried to stage a comeback, but in the end, all she managed to do was remind everyone exactly why they loved living next door to the world's most chill fire marshal. The aftermath of Karen's kitchen mishap became the stuff of neighborhood legend. By Saturday morning, everyone had heard about how her safe indoor cooking setup had gone up in smoke, literally, and how Jim, the ever-reliable fire marshal, had saved the day yet again. The irony was simply too delicious to ignore, and it didn't take long for jokes to start circulating. One neighbor even quipped that Karen should install a plaque in her kitchen, honoring Jim as the unofficial HOA fire safety consultant. Karen, however, wasn't laughing. In fact, she seemed to retreat further into her shell after the incident. Her once rigid enforcement of HOA rules all but disappeared overnight. Gone were the clipboard ambushes, the unsolicited lectures on lawn care, and the nitpicking about holiday decorations. Instead, Karen kept to herself, avoiding eye contact with neighbors and sticking to short, awkward waves when passing by. It was almost as if she decided to erase herself from the community entirely. For Emma and her family, life returned to normal, or as normal as things could be after such a bizarre chain of events. Jim went back to his weekend grilling routine, flipping burgers with the same calm precision that had earned him the nickname Grill Master. Neighbors began stopping by more often, bringing over homemade desserts or just chatting while he worked the grill. Some even asked for tips on safe grilling techniques, which Jim happily shared, turning their backyard into an impromptu neighborhood hub. But karma wasn't quite done with Karen yet. A few weeks later, another incident cemented her reputation as someone who couldn't catch a break. This time, it happened during one of her rare attempts to host another gathering, a book club meeting at her house. Determined to avoid any repeat of the electrical fire fiasco, Karen opted for candles instead of lights to create a cozy atmosphere. Unfortunately, she placed them too close to a stack of paperbacks, and sure enough, disaster struck again. Thankfully, a quick-thinking guest managed to douse the flames before they spread, but not before Karen's panicked screams drew attention from half the block. Jim, hearing the commotion, rushed over with his trusty fire extinguisher, which had since become something of a running joke among the neighbors. Once again, he calmly assessed the situation, put out the small blaze, and offered Karen some friendly advice on candle safety. "Maybe stick to battery-operated ones next time," he suggested with a wink. Karen could only nod mutely, her face flushed with embarrassment. By now, even Karen's staunchest supporters in the HOA had started to distance themselves. At the next monthly meeting, several members proposed loosening some of the stricter rules, citing the importance of balance and common sense. To everyone's surprise, Karen didn't object. She sat quietly in the corner, barely saying a word, looking like a shadow of her former self. Rumor had it she was considering stepping down from her role altogether. As the weeks turned into months, the neighborhood settled into a new rhythm, one that felt lighter and less tense than before. Without Karen's constant policing, people began embracing their individuality. Colorful flower arrangements popped up in yards, quirky lawn decorations made appearances, and spontaneous barbecues became a regular occurrence. Even Karen's yard, once the epitome of sterile perfection, softened slightly, with a few wildflowers creeping into her meticulously trimmed garden. Emma couldn't help but reflect on how much had changed since that fateful Saturday afternoon. What started as a petty dispute over grilling had somehow transformed their community for the better. And while she wouldn't wish embarrassment on anyone, not even Karen, it was hard not to see the humor in how everything had unfolded. One evening, as Emma sat on her parents' porch watching Jim grill dinner, she turned to him with a grin. "You know, Dad, I think you've officially earned your place in neighborhood history." Jim chuckled, flipping a burger with practiced ease. "All I wanted to do was cook some food and enjoy my Saturday. Turns out, that's all anyone really needed." And with that, the story came full circle, a reminder that sometimes the best way to bring people together is through laughter, humility, and maybe a perfectly grilled burger. Months had passed since the infamous Grillgate incident and Karen's subsequent kitchen mishaps, but the story remained a cherished topic of conversation in the neighborhood. It wasn't just about the absurdity of what had happened, it was about how it brought people closer together. The once tense atmosphere in the cul-de-sac had softened into something warmer, more welcoming. Neighbors who used to exchange polite nods now shared meals, laughed over coffee, and even organized weekend gatherings. And at the center of it all was Jim, whose calm demeanor and good-natured humor had turned him into a local legend. Karen, for her part, had undergone a quiet transformation. She no longer patrolled the streets with her clipboard or lectured others about HOA rules. Instead, she kept to herself, tending to her garden and occasionally waving hello to passersby. While some neighbors still teased her lightly about her past antics, most felt a sense of sympathy. After all, everyone makes mistakes, even someone as determined as Karen, and her humbling experiences seemed to have taught her a valuable lesson about humility and minding her own business. One crisp autumn afternoon, Emma noticed something unusual while walking her dog. Karen's front yard was decorated with colorful pumpkins, twinkling fairy lights, and a cheerful scarecrow holding a sign that read, "Happy Fall, y'all." It was a far cry from her usual minimalist aesthetic. Emma couldn't help but smile. Maybe Karen was finally learning to loosen up and embrace life's little joys, or maybe she was trying to win back some goodwill. Either way, it was a step in the right direction. That evening, Jim hosted one of his now famous barbecues, inviting neighbors to gather in their backyard for food, drinks, and laughter. The picnic tables were laden with homemade dishes, from savory casseroles to gooey brownies, and the air smelled of grilled chicken and smoky ribs. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting golden hues across the sky, the group erupted into applause when Jim unveiled a giant trophy-like platter labeled "World's Best Grill Master." Emma stood off to the side, snapping photos and marveling at how much things had changed. This was more than just a barbecue. It was a celebration of community, resilience, and the power of finding humor in life's challenges. Even Karen showed up unexpectedly, clutching a plate of store-bought cookies and looking slightly nervous. But instead of teasing her, the neighbors welcomed her warmly, thanking her for contributing to the spread. "Hey, Karen," one neighbor called out jokingly, raising a plastic cup of lemonade. "Next time you need fire safety tips, just ask Jim, okay?" The crowd burst into laughter, including Karen, who managed a small smile. "Noted," she replied quietly, though her tone carried a hint of gratitude. For the first time in months, she seemed genuinely relaxed, almost like she belonged. As the night wore on, Emma found herself sitting beside her dad near the grill, watching sparks float lazily into the darkening sky. "You know," she said thoughtfully, "this whole thing started because of your burgers. Who would have thought they'd end up changing the neighborhood?" Jim chuckled, flipping another piece of chicken. "Sometimes it's the little things that make the biggest difference," he said. "Good food, good company, and a willingness to laugh at ourselves. That's all anyone really needs." By the end of the evening, as the last guests drifted home and the stars blinked overhead, Emma realized something important. The drama with Karen hadn't just been about enforcing rules or proving a point. It had been a reminder of what truly mattered: connection, kindness, and the ability to find joy in the unexpected twists of life. And as long as Jim kept firing up the grill, there would always be a reason to come together and celebrate. In the end, Karen's overzealousness had unintentionally sparked something beautiful. A neighborhood united not by rigid guidelines, but by shared moments and memories. And for that, everyone, including Karen, was grateful.